In a grand hall draped with the flags of every African nation, silence reigned. No drums, no applause, only a single voice that cut through the air like thunder. We will never be great if we keep trying to eat from our neighbor's plate. The room froze. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others lowered their gaze. Because this was not just a speech, it was a moral reckoning. For decades, Africa's leaders have met in the same kind of rooms, polished wood, shining microphones, and empty promises. But this time, something was different. Sitting side by side were the foreign ministers of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the nations of the Alliance of Sahel States AES. Once isolated, now united. They were not talking about aid or loans or handshakes with foreign ambassadors. They were talking about each other, about trust, brotherhood, and the kind of solidarity that had been missing since the fall of Libya. The speaker's words struck deep. When Niger was threatened, Mali and Burkina Faso said, "If you attack them, you attack us." And for the first time in modern history, Africa did not bow, it stood up. This wasn't about diplomacy anymore. It was about dignity, about remembering that freedom means nothing if it's not shared among brothers. Can you imagine if back in 2011 Africa had spoken with one voice when the bombs fell over Tripoli? How different would this world look today? This is not a speech for headlines. It's a warning and a promise. Because what begins in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey may one day echo far beyond the Sahel. So stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why Africa's new revolution isn't about weapons or elections. It's about something far more powerful: unity with a conscience. When the minister took the floor that day, he didn't begin with numbers or reports. He began with disappointment, the kind that only comes from betrayal. "The Africans did not defend us," he said quietly. Even when the storm came, our brothers turned away. There was no anger in his tone, only a heavy truth that silenced the hall. He recalled the day his country faced condemnation at the United Nations. Instead of standing together, African nations voted against one another as if colonialism had ended on paper but not in the heart. Then came his warning, firm and measured: "We cannot belong to a regional union and still decide to attack one of our own." The message was unmistakable. He was speaking about Niger and the failed attempt by ECOWAS to sanction and even invade it after its military transition. But that time, something happened that shocked the world. Burkina Faso and Mali stood up. They told the West African bloc, and by extension the West, that any attack on Niger would mean war against them too. That single declaration, simple yet thunderous, changed everything. For the first time in modern Africa, three nations stood shoulder to shoulder, not under the flag of some foreign alliance, but under the banner of sovereignty. In that moment, history turned. It was as if the spirit of Thomas Sankara had whispered through the Sahel. When your brother's house is burning, you don't wait for the flames to reach yours. You run to help him. And that's exactly what they did. The minister's words that day weren't just about politics, they were about memory. He reminded the audience of Libya 2011, when African nations stayed silent as foreign powers rained destruction on a fellow African state. Imagine, he said, if Africa had spoken with one voice back then. Would Gaddafi have fallen so easily? Would the Sahel be drowning in chaos today? The room fell into a painful silence. Everyone knew the answer. From there, his tone shifted from grief to resolve. He called for the creation of a new African security doctrine, one that rejects dependence on foreign military aid and private contractors. He spoke of professionalizing and coordinating African forces, building defense industries on African soil, and crafting an intelligence network that answers only to Africa. "We don't make our own weapons," he said, "and as long as we rely on others to defend us, we will never be free." He then laid out a vision that transcended politics, a vision of Pan-African solidarity from the deserts of Mali to the Atlantic coast. It was not anti-Western, it was anti-submission. It was a call to maturity, to moral clarity, and to unity through responsibility. As he spoke, the camera panned across faces: old generals, young delegates, journalists, frozen mid-sentence. Some took notes, others simply listened, perhaps realizing for the first time that this was not another conference. This was a reckoning. He ended that section of his address with one of the most powerful lines ever spoken in an African Union meeting: "Security can only exist through solidarity." And if we fail to understand that, we will remain a continent defended by others, governed by fear, and forgotten by history. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous, rising like the rhythm of a heartbeat, the heartbeat of a continent remembering itself. And somewhere in the back of that hall, someone whispered what many were thinking, This feels like the beginning of something. The turning point came when the minister raised his hand and paused not for drama, but for gravity. It is time, he said slowly, that Africa lives in the 21st century like the rest of the world. It wasn't just a statement. It was an accusation, a cry, and a command all at once. The camera caught faces tightening, some nodding, some refusing to meet his eyes. He spoke next of poverty, the kind that strips a continent not only of wealth but of dignity. As long as we are poor, he said, no one will respect us. His words were met with murmurs of approval from the back rows, where young delegates from Burkina Faso and Niger sat upright, fists clenched. Then his tone shifted from frustration to vision. He proposed what he called an African continental initiative for the eradication of poverty. It wasn't a charity proposal, but a moral revolution. He reminded them that China, once mocked by the world, had become a global power only after it lifted its people from poverty. When I was a child, he said they used to mock the Chinese. In America, people would say, lucky like a Chinaman, meaning you had no chance in life. But today, China stands equal to the United States. Why? Because they ended poverty. We must do the same. The room erupted in applause, long sustained, defiant. Even some of the older diplomats who had arrived skeptical were now on their feet. And then came the emotional climax. His voice softened. It is inconceivable that in the 21st century, African women still die giving birth because they lack access to healthcare. It is inconceivable that our children go to school hungry. It is inconceivable that our graduates, our doctors, our engineers sit jobless with their diplomas in their hands. Each sentence landed like a hammer. The audience, once restless, now hung on every word. You could see tears glistening in the eyes of some delegates. It is time, he repeated. It is time for Africa to live in this century not as a beggar, not as a victim, but as a builder. That was when something unexpected happened. The hall, filled with seasoned politicians, broke into spontaneous applause. Not the formal kind. It was raw, human, emotional. People rose to their feet, shouting, clapping, even pounding on the tables. And in that noise, something sacred broke open. It was the sound of belief returning. But the minister wasn't finished. When the crowd quieted, he turned to the representatives of ECOWAS. Our institutions, he said, must reform, or they will be remembered as machines of the elite, not of the people. He denounced what ECOWAS had become a club of comfortable leaders sending their children abroad while lecturing the poor about democracy. If ECOWAS does not change, he warned, it will no longer be the voice of West Africa. It will be its echo. A low murmur rippled through the audience, a mixture of shock and admiration. Some ministers stared at the table, others nodded quietly. It was the first time anyone had spoken those words out loud. Then his message turned inward again to Africa's soul. He called for a cultural revolution, not of ideology, but of identity. You, the connected generation, he said to the young, you speak to the world through your phones, but do you still know who you are? If you go to the global market empty-handed without your culture, without your story, you will be absorbed. The room grew still. He spoke of history stolen, of Mali's Emperor Abubakar II, who reached the Americas long before Columbus, a reminder that Africa once led the world in navigation, knowledge, and courage. No one will tell our story for us, he said. We must tell it ourselves with science, with art, with pride. By the time he finished, the audience was no longer just listening. They were transformed from spectators into witnesses of something larger than themselves. And as the final applause filled the air, one could feel it, the birth of a new conviction that Africa's rebirth would not come through pity or permission, but through memory and moral power. The echoes of that speech did not fade with applause. They lingered in corridors, in headlines, and most importantly, in hearts. For many who were there, it was no longer a diplomatic meeting. It was a mirror forcing African leaders to confront what they had become. Overnight, the message spread across the Sahel. In Ouagadougou, people gathered in cafes and on radio shows speaking not of politics, but of possibility. In Bamako, students quoted his words like scripture. And in Niamey, soldiers in the barracks replayed the video, nodding silently when he said, security can only exist through solidarity. The ripple effect was real. Ordinary citizens began to question the meaning of regional integration when those very institutions had failed to protect them. ECOWAS, once viewed as the guardian of democracy, was now seen by many as a symbol of betrayal, too close to foreign interests, too far from African realities. Within weeks, discussions erupted about reforming ECOWAS from the ground up. Civil organizations demanded representation. Young activists called for audits of international funds. Economists proposed a joint Sahel development bank financed not by foreign loans, but by gold, cotton, and phosphate revenues. Across borders, the idea of African interdependence began to replace the old rhetoric of nationalism. Radio hosts in Senegal, Ghana, and Guinea asked the same question: can we finally imagine an Africa that protects its own? Meanwhile, political leaders found themselves under new pressure. The people had heard the message and they were no longer willing to accept the old excuses. In the streets of Burkina Faso, murals appeared overnight: unis ou rien, united or nothing. But with awakening came confrontation. Some Western diplomats called the speech provocative, dangerous, even anti-democratic. Yet what truly frightened them was not the words themselves, but the unity they inspired. Because for the first time in decades, Africa was beginning to define democracy on its own terms. The civil consequences went beyond politics. Universities began reviving African philosophy programs. Cultural centers in Dakar and Abidjan hosted debates about La Révolution culturelle, the cultural awakening he called for. Churches and mosques spoke of moral responsibility between nations. Even small cooperatives in rural areas began to coordinate cross-border trade, no longer waiting for government permission. On the political level, the effect was seismic. Burkina Faso proposed a Pan-African Security Council independent from external donors. Mali reopened its local armament plant, the first step towards self-produced defense. Niger initiated training programs for rural engineers under the slogan "Nous protéger, c'est nous nourrir." Each move signaled the same truth: the era of dependency was being questioned. And yet not all welcomed it. Certain elites, those who thrived under the old system of endless aid and polite submission, whispered warnings of isolationism. But the people weren't listening anymore. They had heard something truer. Because in the end, this wasn't only about governments. It was about a moral contract between citizens and their continent, a recognition that poverty, disunity, and foreign control were not inevitable, but chosen. And if they were chosen, they could be undone. For the first time in a generation, the idea of a sovereign Africa no longer felt like a slogan. It felt like a direction, messy, uncertain, but profoundly real. And beneath that uncertainty, one conviction grew stronger by the day: if the leaders failed to reform, the people would do it themselves. From Washington to Brussels, the reaction was swift and uneasy. Western analysts didn't miss the symbolism of that speech. The words, "we will no longer allow one African country to attack another," struck deeper than any military declaration. Because for decades, the global system had thrived on precisely the opposite, keeping Africa divided, dependent, and distracted. In policy circles, the speech was described as a populist wave. But those who truly understood history saw something else: the echo of America's own revolution. 250 years ago, a group of farmers, craftsmen, and thinkers stood before an empire and declared the same thing Africa is now daring to say: that dignity cannot be negotiated. The minister's call for unity, for an end to poverty, for cultural pride, it's not anti-Western. It's Jeffersonian. It's Franklin reborn in the Sahel. It's the belief that men and women born free can govern themselves without permission from across the ocean. And that's why it unsettled so many. Because in the speech of an African minister, the West heard the sound of a world shifting not toward war, but toward self-respect. In the United States, a handful of commentators compared his words to the early civil rights movement. What Traore and his allies are doing, one analyst said, is the global version of what Martin Luther King preached: the right to shape your own destiny. Others, of course, were less kind. Western media headlines called the AES bloc anti-democratic, authoritarian, militarized. But behind those words lay a quiet fear that Africa no longer needs permission to define its democracy. Across Europe, reactions split. In Paris, the political class remained tense. France's influence in the Sahel, already crumbling, seemed to fade with every speech like this. In Rome and Berlin, younger politicians whispered admiration: "They are doing what we once did, defending sovereignty." Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, the tone was opportunistic. Offers of partnership poured in infrastructure, defense, trade. But the African leaders' response was measured: "We seek cooperation, not new masters." It was a sentence that drew applause across the global South. For older Americans watching from afar, the message carried a strange familiarity. After all, this was the same dream that birthed their own nation, the idea that people once written off as powerless could defy empires through courage and conviction. The difference is that Africa's fight today isn't about independence, it's about respect, and respect cannot be granted, it must be reclaimed. The minister's voice reminded the world that global order built on exploitation cannot last. If we remain poor, he said, the world will never take us seriously. But in truth, that line applies far beyond Africa. It is a warning to every nation, even America itself, about the dangers of moral poverty, of forgetting the values that once made it great. And somewhere between Washington's silence and Africa's rising voice, the world began to understand. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to humanity's oldest question. Who gets to decide whose freedom matters? The minister's final words did not echo, they lingered like a soft tremor beneath the applause. Africa stands at a crossroads, he said. We can no longer afford to dream alone. We must dare together. Those words carried more weight than any resolution passed that day. Because the truth is, Africa's greatest challenge has never been its poverty, it has been its fragmentation. A continent rich in diamonds, gold, and sunlight, but divided by borders it never drew. He reminded them that solidarity is not a slogan, it's survival. If one African nation burns, the smoke touches them all. And if one rises, the dawn belongs to everyone. It was not a speech against the West, it was a message to humanity. The same call that once echoed from Boston Harbor now rises from Ouagadougou, the cry of those who refuse to live forever on someone else's terms. Yet the warning was clear. If we fail to unite, he said, we will be governed not by our leaders, but by our fears. For the elders in the audience and for those of us watching from afar, it felt almost biblical. A reminder that history does not wait for the cautious. That the world does not respect those who beg, but those who build. Across the Sahel, his message has already found roots. Young men in Bamako quote him at protests. Women in Niamey teach their children the meaning of sovereignty. Farmers in Kaya paint his words on the walls of their homes, unis ou rien. United or nothing. And beyond Africa, many of us in America, in Europe, in the diaspora, are quietly asking ourselves, when was the last time we stood for something that wasn't convenient, but necessary? Because what Africa is daring to do now, to believe again, to trust itself again, might just be the moral compass the world has lost. So let me ask you, do you believe that a continent long silenced can still write its own story? Do you believe that men like Ibrahim Traoré are not the exception, but the beginning of something larger? If you do, then share this message. Share it because truth is contagious and courage even more so. And if you believe, as we do, that unity is the only revolution left worth fighting for, then subscribe because history is no longer being written in Washington or Paris. It's being written in the heart of Africa.